think in life we don't often have solutions. Actually, we have choices, and they're not the same thing. And sometimes you're just making the best choice in a situation that has no good solutions. And those are the times when we really need help, when we really need art to guide us. We need books, we need narrative, we need, all kinds of art to show us how to get through those situations, because that's when we're the underdog, and that's when lip service from someone else, or pat advice from your friend might not cut it. We need to go deeper. We need to look at a book that covers something that we're kind of dealing with right now. So my best teachers have always been books, and in lieu of having other role models that I can count on, sometimes fictional characters are the ones that I base my life on, for better or for worse.
Welcome to Small Acts of Rebellion, a podcast where the unspoken narratives at the intersection of our personal and professional lives come to light. I'm your host, Heather Pridemore, your guide on this journey of discovery and defiance. Join me as we uncover the rebellious spirit that shapes our careers and lives. It's time to own your story. Are you ready? Today's guest is Erika Krouse, the author of 4 books spanning fiction and nonfiction, including her short story collection, Save Me, Stranger, recently published by Flatiron Books in January 2025. Erika's acclaimed memoir, Tell Me Everything, The Story of a Private Investigation, was named a New York Times Editor's Choice and has won the Edgar Award, the Colorado Book Award, and the Housatonic Book Award. Her short fiction has been featured in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Esquire.com, and more. Erika also mentors emerging writers through the book project at Lighthouse Writers Workshop, where she received the Beacon Award for teaching excellence. Welcome to the show, Erika.
Thank you so much, Heather. I really appreciate being here.
So I'm really excited, Erika. You are probably the most famous person who's ever been on my show.
Oh, dear.
I typically interview everyday people because I really always want to talk about really accessible stories and that intersection between the personal and the professional. And so one of the things that really drew me to reaching out to you was your memoir, Tell Me Everything, because you were a private investigator, but you were also really sort of grappling with this intersection of the personal and the professional because of the story that you were investigating. And I just found that really interesting. First of all, I don't know very many private investigators, just one. Now you're number 2.
Oh, cool.
And you're also the first female private investigator that I think I know of. I mean, typically when you even see them on TV, they're often men. And so I just thought that was really interesting. And then the timing of us connecting just happened to coincide with your new book, Save Me, Stranger, which we'll certainly talk about. But I thought it would be great if we could really just start with kind of your personal story and really focus on Tell Me Everything. I thought that might be a good place for us to start the conversation.
Sure. So, it is kind of a little bit of a weird book because it's about a historic lawsuit that I was lucky enough to work on. So the book itself is about the first ever Title IX sexual assault case in history, which happened right here in Colorado. And now, when we think of Title IX, we think of sexual assault, but back in the day, that wasn't true. So this case began in 2002, and I lucked upon a job as a private investigator working on that case, and that's the primary plot of the memoir. However, there is this other subplot element to it in that I myself was a victim of sexual violence as a young child, so it was really compromising for me to work on this case. It was really, really hard. So yeah, there was a lot of not just intersection, but almost like a infection of the personal in the professional and the professional in the personal as well when I worked on that case as well. So it definitely wasn't easy. When I was writing the book, I really didn't want to tell my own story. I didn't want to, I'm actually a very private person. You wouldn't know because I'm just, I'm like blah, blah, blah right now. But I don't actually usually talk about my past, my history, and all the family stuff. I don't talk about that. But when I was writing the book, I realized who am I? Who am I to write about this? Yeah, I worked on the case, but so did a lot of people. And why would a reader even care about my perspective on it? Right. And as my previous two books have been fiction. So I thought, well, if as a fiction writer, if I were writing this as a novel, what characteristics might I give the protagonist? And I said, well, I'd have to show that this person has skin in the game, that this person was somehow invested in the story to make it even make sense why I would use that perspective character. So that's why I included my personal story, but it was very reluctant. We sold the book on proposal, and my first few tries, my agent kept kicking it back because she had to explain to me, hey, if you're going to write a memoir, you have to be in the memoir. And I was like, oh gosh, no, I don't want to do that. But okay. So it was best for the book for me to do it, and I'm glad I did it because I'm not alone, and this is a problem for a lot of people. And I think, quote unquote, coming out as a sexual assault survivor was helped other people to open up, not just to me, but to the book, you know what I mean? To sort of come to terms with anything that had happened to them in a more direct way, because here's a book that has maybe something similar to their story in it.
Yeah, Erica, I think for me, that was one of the things that actually resonated. I mean, while I thought at the surface level, the idea of like being a private investigator was really interesting. And, I think that this would have been an interesting conversation no matter what your sort of personal connection was to your job as a private investigator. One of the things that made it really resonate with me is, I also have stuff in my past that interestingly enough has never correlated directly with any job I've held, but has certainly shown up in ways that impacted the ways in which I navigate the world, the ways I, understand things that are happening. And so I think that made the story really accessible for me as well, which was also part of the reason I was interested in talking to you, because I just thought, here's someone who has an experience that is similar to probably a lot of other people's, right? There's probably some universal themes there, and we're channeling it through a very particular like set of circumstances. And so I think that was part of what made the book really made me feel like I really connected with the story. And so I know probably lots of people appreciate the fact that you were willing to kind of put yourself out there, and it's certainly very vulnerable and exposing in a lot of ways. And so one of the things I'm just wondering about is how that intersection of those things, or that intertwining, or that infection, as you called it, how did that reshape your understanding of yourself and your sense of identity? So, I mean, having a personal experience and then a professional one, like how did that sort of help you evolve in that way?
I think I'd always seen my past as a liability before I wrote the book. I think I always saw it as like something. I mean, it was something to overcome, and it still is every day. I remember, people have asked since I wrote this book, they've been like, "Oh, have you healed?" And I'm like, "Well, it's like there's a process of healing, right? Every day you heal in a different way, and every day you're broken in a completely different way." So I've always seen it as something to compensate for in a way. But now I don't necessarily feel that way. I do think that every experience everyone has influences everything they do. It's not that we're ruled by our past, because I really don't believe that. But our pasts do help us form value systems and working philosophies and ways forward that help us in our jobs or hurt us in our jobs, or sometimes both. And I was thinking recently about, how sometimes my neuroses actually help the job as a writer, because it's not a normal job. It's it involves so much hat switching. I think maybe like 15 hats, and at least, and it also, you have to have a recklessness about your own life that I think most people would not. I think most people take perhaps a healthier approach to their lives and guard their privacy, and decide for safer courses of action. But growing up how I did, I kind of feel everything seems rather theoretical anyway. So it feels different for me to throw myself onto the horns of possible censure or adversity or whatever, than it might for another person. So I'm trying to see the, in my older age, I'm trying to see my past experience as just part of the whole picture instead of like, oh, I have to compensate for this and I have to compensate for that. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't, I do. As and you shared that you've had things to overcome as well, and you know what that's like. But sometimes it can be a strange advantage as well. So yeah, I don't know. I always think of identity as a very fluid thing, as it's a pretty much a minute to minute thing in a way. And if you did grow up under adverse circumstances, it's even more so. I think you're always saying, well, what and who am I right now? Am I even here? Um, so in a way that can be freeing in a way when you're working on a project, I think, especially a creative project.
One of the patterns that I recognized in years of leadership and sort of corporate America was that a lot of folks who come, let's just say, from like a blue collar background and they move into a white collar profession, a lot of the narratives that they learned growing up, whether that be just those sayings like, work hard and, you'll be successful, or maybe it's even personal narratives, right? Things that have happened in their past that have sort of informed how they process information, how they see the world. Those things, especially when you're making that transition from distinctly different cultural perspectives, blue collar versus white collar, can really inhibit someone's ability to they get stuck somewhere in the middle, right? They're like, the hard work carries you so far, for example, and then one day you're just like, well, why am I not progressing any further? And it has a lot more to do with your belief systems and your mindset and some of those narratives than it does with like the actual system itself. Because when you can kind of sort of unburden yourself from some of that stuff, then you start to have a little bit of a clearer picture. And so one of the things that I think is really interesting about our stories is not only do our stories sort of impact our trajectories in life and career, but they also evolve, right? So as we gain more information, we start to see our stories differently. And so, I mean, I don't know what your perspective is on that, Erika, because like as an author, you have a very different view of stories and narratives than probably the average person. But any thoughts on sort of like the evolution and, like the way our stories kind of shape us?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I teach a lot. I teach at Lighthouse Writers Workshop, and I also have clients. And there's this one element of narrative that I find really interesting. I think I don't know if people talk about it that much. I haven't heard it, but I call it the code. So, whatever a protagonist's code is at the beginning is usually tested through the middle, and then at the end of a story it changes into something else. Now, of course, in life it just keeps changing and changing and changing. It's always tested constantly, but in the story you're creating, you're a little bit more of a full circle, or not necessarily full circle, but an arc that leads you to somewhere else. And I think that's true of us in many ways, because we come to a situation or come to any predicament with all the things that we have been taught in one way or another, through either we've been directly taught them, like I know I've been told as a child, you can be anything you want to be if you put your mind to it, right? But I've also noticed that that's lip service, right? There is a glass ceiling. There are things that I have to work 20 times as hard to do to get half the credit, and and I just based on actually based on being a woman in America, right? But add to other cultural influences. For example, there is a culture around sexual abuse survivors. That's an actual culture. It's a subculture of all society, really, and there are different rules to that. And there are also personal family lessons that you learn that are either told to you or shown to you. And all those things sort of create that, and your wounds, right? Like whatever wounded you creates a value system. For example, you if you hurt a child, the child learns the world's a dangerous place. That's a code, right? And we have so many of these swimming around in us. And then through coming of age, through adulthood, through daily life, these shift every day. And this is why I think things like, I don't know, the Trump election really shook people up, because they had initial codes that they had believed, oh, well, America is this kind of a land and we believe in this kind of justice. And then all of a sudden everything's shaken up, and wow, this isn't what I thought it was. We're not, you know as a people, we're not what we thought we were. And that shift of codes is incredibly demoralizing. It spawns all sorts of things, from, the intense psychological problems to whole movements like of absurd, the theater of the absurd and existentialism, and all those things kind of come from this shifting of code and a changing of our narrative. And for me, that's one of the main arcs of a story, is the shifting of a code from this to this place of instability to a more final code, which makes our life more understandable in a way, because that's what we're always trying to do. We're always trying to figure out what life is, and where we fit in it, and how we can think about it.
Yeah, that resonates a lot, Erica. I actually think that's probably a good segue, because when I read Save Me Stranger, I don't want to give anything away because I certainly want people to read the book, but I found that sort of approach to the short story vignettes were really interesting, because you could really insert yourself into sort of a moment, or a short time frame, and really connect with the characters. And so, I mean, admittedly, I cried after the very first story.
Oh, really?
I did.
Aw.
I cried twice while reading Save Me Stranger, and one of them was the opening story, and then I think Eat My Moose was the
Oh, eat
other
my.
one.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I still
So
cry.
so I
Yeah.
cried twice, and some of my own personal sort of interpretations or takeaways. And for those listening, whenever you approach a piece of art or writing or whatever, you always have to remember that you're bringing some of your own baggage to whatever that experience is. And so everything I'm saying is just my own personal take, my own interpretation. Like we just said, right? Our lives kind of inform the stories and how we navigate the world and how we process information. And so based on my own perspective, I really took away from the book, after I finished reading it, I thought, okay, Save Me Stranger. The stranger is the self, was my takeaway, right? So I really saw the stranger who we were asking to save us through this sort of, subject matter was really about the self. And I guess really why that resonated with me is because I saw a lot of self-advocacy in the stories. And it's certainly one of those patterns that I've noticed in my own life. Self-advocacy has been really important to sort of navigate my world. And it's certainly one of the things that I mentor others and coach others to incorporate into their work lives and day-to-day lives. And so having some of that self-advocacy. And then I think the other thing that I noticed too that sort of resonated with me is that all the vignettes from my perspective were more about the journey and less about the outcome. So I felt like even though some of the stories kind of ended on what felt a bit like a cliffhanger, and I usually hate cliffhangers, I didn't feel dissatisfied at the end because the journey part of it was so rich. And I felt satiated by the sort of process of getting to wherever we got versus feeling sort of jilted because I didn't know what had happened in the end. And so that was sort of my interpretation of the story. But I guess when you think about the story, because I mean you're the author, Erica, when you think about the story, what questions about human nature, identity, or belonging were you really interested in confronting through these stories? Because I feel like while they have some similarities, they're all very distinctly different as well.
Yeah. So I was very interested in the idea of our responsibility to each other as human beings. Where do we fit in with each other? What do we owe each other? How can we help each other? How do we try to help each other and hurt each other? Where are the boundaries of what we can do? And what prompted all of this was the suicide of a friend of mine. I wasn't actually writing short stories at the time when he ended his life, but I had this incredible guilt, and I was supposed to meet with him the day after he ended his life. As far as I could tell, it was not a thought out decision. It was sort of more of a situation where he just, it was spontaneous. So there was that feeling like I could have done something. Maybe anything or anyone could have done something to change that, because it's not like, oh, I've been thinking about this for 5 years and here I've done it. It was it was a blip almost, and then a horrible blip, a tragic blip that impacted everything and everyone in his life. So it just started me thinking about that question, and I never quite answered the question. I for myself, I kept writing stories, and I kept trying to think of well, what about this? What about this? Will this give me the answer? Well, how about this scenario? This one. And none of them did give me a conclusive answer, which I hear what you're saying about the open endings, maybe because there isn't an actual answer, or maybe there are billions of answers that I can't write enough stories to answer the question, because I can't write a story for every single human being on Earth and in the multiverse if there is one. But I think that's what sort of spawns books, is these questions that you don't know the answer to, that all you have to do by the end of writing a book, even a book of 12 stories with 12 different scenarios, maybe all you need is to just understand the question better, and also understand the depth of the question, because each story, uh, it's not like I'm like, oh, let's look at this question from this side, that side, the other side. In some ways, the questions I had spawned more questions about our overall survival, our overall connection to, and you were very astute with that. Like, is that the stranger within ourselves, or the stranger outside of ourselves, the person on the street, the person that maybe we've known a very long time but is still a stranger, or the person that becomes a stranger to us through their actions. So all those things I wanted to explore. And again, I don't know if I got there, but I do feel that at least I feel more peace with the question than I did when I started.
Part of that healing process you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things that, I think stood out for me again was again, that journey was so important, and less important than really the outcome of the stories. And as you were just talking, Erica, it kind of just resonated with me a little bit too, about like real life, because our life doesn't end until the end. And so even though a certain scenario or a certain experience might come to some sort of conclusion, it's still an evolving process, because the story is still evolving. And so I think one of the things that felt really familiar, I guess, about the experience the characters were having was this sort of being in like the thick of it. And, I guess that's why I was saying that like the journey was so decadent, because there was enough happening in the moment that you were just like, this feels real. Like, this feels the way real life feels, complicated, gritty at times. You're confronted with questions that you don't have the answers to, and so you're sort of just like navigating the complexity of all of these different things. And too, there's moments where you're like sort of questioning certain choices that are being made by the characters, and so like, there were moments, I will admit, that I was like feeling a little judgy towards some of like the characters, like, really, that's the choice that you're making right now? Like, you're
Right.
asking this question, but you're taking this action, and these two things seem a little there's some tension there between these two like choices that you're making. And so it was for what it's worth, it was a really enjoyable read. I don't read a ton of fiction, so it was a nice little palate cleanser too for all the other stuff that I consume. I went to your book launch for Save Me Stranger, and
Thank you.
one of the things that you said it was like the only thing I wrote down, because I really didn't want to be overly influenced by that conversation versus this one. You talked about underdogs. And I feel like that ties into the idea of like Save Me Stranger. A lot of the characters in the story are kind of underdogs. And so I don't know if you could just speak a little bit about your philosophy or ideology about like underdogs and their sort of connection to one another.
Sure. Especially readers are attracted to underdogs because readers often are underdogs. Whatever draws us to books is usually not the thing that made us maybe popular in high school, or even in life, right? I think that's something that any reader can readily identify with. But I also think, really, even no matter who you are, you might feel like an underdog in this situation or that situation. We all enter situations where we feel vulnerable. So that vulnerability is at the key of story. I personally don't want to read about someone who's always on top and was born on third base and just has everything easy for them, because I can't identify with that. And I actually don't even know anyone who can identify with that. Even if I feel that way about them, I'll be like, oh, they're so lucky, but they don't feel that way about themselves, right? So underdogs are the characterization cornerstone of literature in a way, and also I think human experience. And we root for the underdog. We don't root for well, I don't root for and or vote for the person who's always had it handed to them. I like the person coming up from behind and overcoming adversity. It's also a way that we as human beings learn, and how we navigate our own lives is we see how people who maybe had it worse or had it harder dealt with situations that they didn't know how to deal with, and we learn from that, and we take it as a note for ourselves to go forth into our own lives and our own problems and issues and challenges and compromises, to see what we can say, oh well, that person in that fictional story did this thing, and maybe I can find inspiration for that to find a solution for myself. And I think in life we don't often have solutions. Actually, we have choices, and they're not the same thing. And sometimes you're just making the best choice in a situation that has no good solutions. And those are the times when we really need help, when we really need art to guide us. We need books, we need narrative, we need, all kinds of art to show us how to get through those situations, because that's when we're the underdog, and that's when lip service from someone else, or pat advice from your friend might not cut it. We need to go deeper. We need to look at a book that covers something that we're kind of dealing with right now. So my best teachers have always been books, and in lieu of having other role models that I can count on, sometimes fictional characters are the ones that I base my life on, for better or for worse.
I love when you access, whether it's a book or a movie, but when you're sort of taking in a narrative and you learn a lesson that's like relevant, but like has really nothing to do with the story. So like there's that process of making connections between things that on the surface seem like really unrelated, but you still are able to access some kind of lesson that's useful for yourself, even though the character's journey is not at all the one that you're on, but it still provides some sort of like helpful piece to whatever this puzzle is that you're trying to solve. And so I always find that really interesting, when you songs too, sometimes like a song, like the lyrics to a song, you're like, this has nothing to do with what I'm dealing with, but for some reason there's some lesson here that's like helpful to the decision that I'm making or the question that I'm asking. And so I always find that really interesting about the various like forms of expression and art making. So I think that's probably a good transition though, because one of the things that I wanted to talk about with you, Erika, is just like overarching themes. And so, just I didn't read all of your books, so I actually had trouble finding one of them. But the themes, from what I could research, tend to be around power and vulnerability, isolation, connection, trauma, and healing, right? Those were some of like the overarching themes that kind of run through all of these various things that you've written. And so when you think about the stories that you've been drawn to tell, what do you feel they reveal about the questions you're still trying to answer for yourself?
That's a great question. And what you described about trying on different scenarios to answer a question that you have, or a situation that you have in your life that's completely unrelated, that's really the process, I think, of writing. I think that's what writers do, is even though a story might be influenced by a situation in your life, but you write a completely different scenario. Like you mentioned the story Eat My Moose in Save Me Stranger, and that was influenced by the death of a friend, and that story has nothing to do with her, except for there's kind of a personality similarity between a character and her, and I miss her, and I miss that personality, right? But that's it. But still, that even though that story isn't related to the questions I have about her death, it somehow answers it anyway. And I don't think any writer thinks about it necessarily thematically in quite that way. I don't think they say, "Oh, well, I write about power and vulnerability and isolation and connection." So what'll fit those? What'll check those boxes to stay on brand? No one does that. I don't think. I think we just have things in our lives that we don't understand. I think I don't understand the nature of power very well. I think I struggle with vulnerability. Isolation has been a theme of my life, and it's just sort of this assumed content of a story for me, right? Same with trauma and healing. I don't even know for sure how to define that. So these things were connection. I do, all I know about connection is that it's vital, but how to do it depends on every single situation that you're ever in. So I think sometimes a theme is determined, like from someone's work, just based on like who they are as a human being and what they still have unanswered for themselves, what they'll maybe be working on their whole life. Maybe that's their life's work, is to work on that thematic issue. But most writers, I don't think, even are aware of the themes of their work. I think we're just, making up stories that hit something in us, where we feel it. We feel like we did something and we feel like it's ours. And then that's where that connects back into the identity piece. If it's addressing the things you're working on in that period of your life, then it's yours. If it's really, you're just trying to make a thing, it's not really yours. It's just something, it's just a thing you did with your time. Does that make sense?
It does. As you were talking, Erica, I thought about how, like, our history is often best understood in hindsight, right? And so I'm actually reading a nonfiction book right now, and they were summarizing this particular person's like career journey, and I just thought that's such an oversimplification of like this person's career. And yes, in this example, this person like leveled up several times in their career journey, and I thought, well, that's great. And it certainly sets like an optimistic tone about navigating, for example, career development. But at the same time, it's only understood in hindsight. Like when that person was in the thick of it, there were certainly trials and tribulations that impacted those moments in time, and they were having to make these decisions that they didn't know the outcome of. And so I felt like, I don't know. I've just felt like, okay, that's a part of the story, right? And it's so much easier to look back in hindsight and understand it. And themes make sense in the same way, right? We're thematically drawn to things, all of us, whether we're authors or not, right? We all find ourselves sort of drawn to certain experiences, narratives, interests, values, and all those things are always best understood through reflection, right? You have to look back to say, okay, where are the patterns? And I think that honestly, for many of us, we don't really take a lot of time to think about the patterns. And so, I mean, I think in a way, maybe authors have a little bit of a leg up on the rest of us, because I mean, there's like this whole process of continuous exploration that it's reflection and expression are certainly skills, and I don't know that many of us are taught how to cultivate those skills. And so authors are that's one of their strengths, is that process of doing those things. And so I don't know, maybe we all have something to learn from authors to better understand our stories, and I guess the questions maybe that we're posing.
I think you're maybe giving us a little bit too much credit because maybe writers it's just a different way they process, but they're doing the same thing everyone else is doing. You know what I mean? For example, some people, if they have a problem, they call their mom. Some people, if they have a problem, they post it for the world on Facebook. Some people, they have the problem, they lock it up tight, throw away the key. Writers make up a story, that it's just it's just a different way of dealing. But I think we're all the same as far as the fact that we're dealing. We're all coping, we're all trying to learn. It's just that writers like stories, they like books, they like to read. And there's also an element, I think, also of if you like something, sometimes you want to make it. I have that personality where, like, if I really like ceramics, so I learned ceramics. I like dogs, so I have a very barky, that you've heard, dog. That's just sort of the way certain people are, right? And books, if you like literature, you want to write a book. Usually, for most people. So, yeah, I don't know if I don't know if writers have a leg up on anyone or anything. And I say that because I know a lot of writers. We're the same as everyone else.
Yeah, I guess I just feel that way a little bit, Erica, because, I have an art background, and I think through that, that practice of expression, it's a skill, creativity is a skill. All these things can be cultivated, but not everybody is given either the opportunities or even knows that they need to pursue the opportunities to sort of strengthen in these various areas. And so while we're all maybe dealing with the same, we're all dealing, right? We're all dealing. We are all coming to it with different strengths and different tools. And so I just see that those tools have been really helpful. I left corporate a couple of years ago, and one of the very first things I sort of acknowledged in that sort of transition and that journey was like how little reflection had happened for over a decade. There was no questioning like, why am I on this path? How did I get here? It was a lot of just like, okay, what's the next step? There was a lot of looking forward, and there was a lot of like, there's some magical place that I'm trying to get to. I don't know exactly what's there when I get there, but I know it's magical, and I know that there's like this place in the end. And then you sort of step out of that narrative, and you're like, oh wait, that's all a bit of a fallacy. Like the journey is actually more important than the destination. And that destination that I was going to like may not actually even exist. And
Right.
and I think that through that process of kind of having new perspective, I realized how little I had questioned or reflected or any of those things. And now, I mean, it's so easy in hindsight, right? To say like, oh, this is something we should all be doing. Like, this is really helpful. But I don't know that many of us like are.
Right. I have to ask, did your purple hair come after you left corporate, or were you purple at corporate?
It was a little bit of a transition. So I had colorful hair in high school, knowing that once I got a job, I wouldn't be able to have colorful hair. And then, of course, I stepped into, adulthood and corporate life. And right towards the end of my transition out of corporate, I had done just like a chunk of color, just like right here in the front. And in my mind, it was, as the title of my podcast, a small act of rebellion, because I'm just like, this piece of colorful hair does not impact my ability to do my job. It doesn't make me any less professional. It no way erodes the sort of mental capacity that I have for the kind of work that I do. It doesn't make me any less of a leader. And so I just kind of did it. And I think it was part of this sort of unraveling that was happening to me at the same time as I was sort of making this transition out of that corporate experience. And I
Right.
mean, a lot of things were happening all at the same time, right? There was sort of some personal questioning, there was evolution of thought process, while at the same time things were changing at the company in which I was working. And so I was on a journey, they were on a journey, and journeys kind of collided. And so I don't know, it's, again, it's one of those things that's so much easier to unpack in hindsight than it was when I was in the thick of it. I mean, when I left corporate initially, I left a job involuntarily. There was a lot of shakeup in the leadership, and they were moving a lot of pieces around. And I thought, I'll just go get another corporate job, like polish up my resume, interview for some jobs. And it was through that process of working with an executive coach to get ready for the next job that I was like, I don't think I want to do this anymore. Like that was the pause to sort of reflect and say, are these the things I want to be doing? Am I happy on this path that I'm on? And it was during that process I was able to ask myself, like, how did I get here? And is this what I want? Does it align with my values? And I just made a really hard, turn from there. And I'm reading another book right now, a nonfiction called This is Strategy. And Seth Godin in This is Strategy talks about the shifting of the playing field or the game, right? Like sometimes we're playing games and we just sort of assume that we have to play by those rules and we have to play that game. But often like we could just change the game. We could make our own rules. Like you don't have to stay
Right.
on that field. And I guess that's where I'm at now is I've shifted board games, and we're doing something
Right.
different now.
It's going back to that our earlier discussion of the code, right? Like sometimes I'll be talking with people and they have such different values from mine. Like I'll say, I'll ask about someone, they'll say, oh, they have a really great job denying insurance claims. I'll be like, what's great about that? That's not a great job. That's a terrible job. They'll be like, oh, well, they make a ton of money. So that's what a good job means in America often to many, many people, right? And that's a whole value system that you can buy into and be on the same verbal page as a lot of people, or but to decide like, no, that's a terrible job, it's an awful job, it's a soul killing job, and it does no good in the world, and you shouldn't do the job. Everyone should get their insurance, money. So that takes rebellion, right? It does take this, large or small act, depending on how you look at it. I mean, changing your life is a large act of rebellion, right? It's to live according to your codes and to say no to things you don't believe in. Sometimes that has a cost, to you. That's a measurable cost, right? Or at least a big psychological cost while you're making the changes. But yeah, like I'm with you. I've done so many jobs, a ridiculous number of jobs in every sphere you can imagine, and it's taught me a lot about where I maybe belong and where I don't belong, and what I do think is a good job. I can't, no matter what it pays, I can't do a job that doesn't align with my principles. But it's a luxury to be able to say that too. I do live in a place, and I'm born in a country where I get to say that. A lot of people, they don't have that choice at all.
Erika, do you think any of that is because you're an artist? I've had some other folks on the show who live more in like the art spaces, and they typically have what I would call a portfolio approach to their career, right? So they've done a lot of jobs. Part of that is sometimes just a necessity of being able to support their art as it's developing. But for others, it's more about just exploration and curiosity and sort of doing lots of different things. And so when you think back on the career part of your story, do you feel like all those different jobs that you've had were because you were an artist and you were sort of trying to do that, or is it for answering some other question?
Well, I think both of those options do imply that I didn't need the money as much as I did. So some of those choices. I mean, I don't know. I've had at least 50 jobs, and I think everything from reading tarot cards on the street to some of that insurance bullshit that I talked about before. So it's been everything, and I think again, part of it was needing money. And part of it also is when I was younger, really pretty young, like 20s, 22 maybe, I thought, okay, because you're taught, get out of college, get a good job, work your way up the ladder, shift jobs if you have to keep working on that ladder, right? Make lateral shifts, but keep climbing. And then I did know someone who was going into the arts, and she said, no, I'm just going to be temping so I can have time to do my artistic pursuits, because that's my real job. It's my real career path, even though it doesn't make money. And I thought, wow, that's awesome. Not to join that rat race, because once you do, right, you join the rat race and you're working overtime, and a 40-hour a week job becomes an 80-hour a week job, especially when you're at the bottom of the ladder. And so that I embraced the gig working model young, and I never really shed it. Although I was doing trying to get gigs every chance I could that would be in my field of work. But it's not like you graduate with your master's in creative writing and people are like, hey, do you want to write short stories for me? I'll pay you and publish them for you. That doesn't often happen, right? You have to really work up to that sort of situation with publishers. So that's where the the hodgepodge of jobs has come from. And I've never had, I don't think since I think maybe 13, I don't think I've had fewer than two jobs at a time. Maybe 14, but I've always had a lot of jobs, again, for financial reasons, and also just to you do some jobs to make money, and you do some jobs to further your career, and you do a lot of stuff for free. So that's kind of how I look at it. And in the end, I think things start to accumulate. There becomes this critical mass that happens if you as an artist, if you take that approach, it happens pretty late, but I think it does happen if you are consistent. The difference between perhaps a writer who publishes and a writer who doesn't publish isn't what people call talent. It's, it has only to do with their ability to adapt and grow and learn, and also just the fact that they don't stop. If you don't stop, eventually you get somewhere, anywhere, right? So that for me is my career strategy. But I wouldn't recommend it to anyone on earth. I don't think I'm a model for how to become a writer. Some people are like, oh, how do I do this? I want to do, I want to do what you're doing. And I'm like, well, just don't listen to me. Really, like I meandered my way. I mean, I work very, very hard. It's like a very hard working meandering, but it's that I've never taken the straight path toward anything. But every side path, every diversion does lead to something else, especially creatively. I feel like I have a lot of material because I've done a lot of weird stuff. And if you do take the safer route in your career, you tend to take the safer route in your art as well.
For what it's worth, Erika, I have yet to meet anyone whose journey was a straight line. Like, everybody meanders.
Okay, good.
I'm pretty sure at this point, I feel pretty confident saying the straight line is a complete fallacy. It's just one of those like bedtime stories we're told about like how careers are supposed to go. But I've yet to meet anyone whose career actually did that. So, who knows? If I interview enough people, maybe we'll find someone who was just like, yeah, it was a straight line. But I even the ones that look sort of straight, often you find that there's some turns and twists and things that weren't expected along the way. So
everything they're not telling you, right? The thing that they keep quiet.
Yeah. So, well, we are approaching the end of the show, Erika, and I love to wrap every episode by saying, if someone said this was way too long, I did not listen, what is one message you'd want someone to take away from this conversation?
Oh God. I would love for someone to listen to this conversation and say, hey, writing sounds pretty cool. I think I want to try that. I mean, it's very simple, but that would be amazing if even just one person was like, I think I'm going to write down some of my stories. I have a pretty weird life too, or I have something to say. So I think that would be my hope.
Awesome. Well, I think we could probably use some more writers and artists in the world. So especially at times like these.
Yes.
Thank you again, Erika, for coming on the show. It's such a pleasure to get to talk to you about your books. It was such a pleasure to read your books. And so I'm really grateful.
Oh, thank you so much, Heather. I appreciate it. You're wonderful to talk to, and I really enjoyed myself. Thank you so much. And I wish you luck with your podcast and everything, your whole life.
Thank you.
Thanks, Heather.
If you enjoyed this episode and are seeking to redefine success on your own terms, subscribe to Small Acts of Rebellion and join a community that celebrates authenticity and personal growth.